Jesus, your nighttime protector in the garden. Most of us experienced nighttime fears as children, and perhaps still feel that ancient unease when darkness falls. This universal experience crosses cultures and centuries, suggesting it serves a deeper purpose than we've recognized. Have you ever wondered why something so natural causes such primal discomfort? Today's narrative speaks directly to that child still within you while providing a theological framework for those you nurture. As we walk with Jesus through a garden illuminated by stars, we discover that darkness was never meant to be feared, but rather embraced as a sacred invitation to divine presence where mysteries unfold. The universal nature of childhood nighttime fears. As the twilight enfolds our child in the garden, consider for a moment that this darkness is not unique to our modern experience. This same darkness has blanketed children throughout human history, from ancient Mesopotamian settlements to medieval villages, from nomadic tents to urban apartments. The darkness that inspires trepidation in the human heart transcends time, geography, and culture, forming a universal thread in the tapestry of childhood experience. Across developmental stages, children experience darkness differently. Infants encounter their first separation anxieties as darkness compounds their sense of isolation. Toddlers, with burgeoning imaginations but limited capacity to distinguish fantasy from reality, populate shadows with unknowns. Older children develop specific fears while adolescents face existential questions that intensify when daylight recedes. Consider this timeless truth: darkness is merely the absence of light, a physical condition with scientific explanation. Yet this rational understanding does little to mitigate our profound emotional response. The human brain, wired for survival, operates like an ancient security system, activating vigilance patterns regardless of intellectual understanding. The amygdala, our brain's fear center, responds to darkness with alertness patterns that predate civilization itself, functioning as a primordial alarm system that remains active despite our modern security. Scripture offers a nuanced theological perspective on darkness that extends beyond simplistic associations with evil. Throughout the biblical narrative, night emerges as a complex symbol, representing vulnerability and uncertainty, yet simultaneously serving as the chosen backdrop for divine revelation. In Genesis, God establishes the rhythm of evening and morning as integral to creation's design, suggesting that darkness was intentionally woven into the fabric of existence. The darkness was not a mistake to be eliminated but a context created with divine purpose. The pattern of God appearing during nighttime moments of human vulnerability forms a striking motif throughout Scripture. Jacob encounters God in a dream as darkness envelops the wilderness around him. The Lord appears to the boy Samuel in the temple during the night watches. The shepherds receive the angelic announcement of Christ's birth against the backdrop of Judean night skies. These narratives suggest that darkness often provides the very conditions in which God chooses to manifest presence. Childhood fears, when examined through a theological lens, reveal themselves as spiritual questions that resonate through human experience. Am I truly safe in this world? Does anyone watch over me when I cannot watch over myself? Am I seen and known in the darkness as well as in the light? These questions persist precisely because they touch upon fundamental theological concerns regarding divine providence, omniscience, and care. Modern approaches to childhood fears have largely secularized what previous generations understood as spiritual experiences. Contemporary solutions focus on psychological techniques, environmental modifications, or behavioral interventions. While valuable, these approaches frequently neglect the spiritual dimension of fear. Child development experts recommend nightlights, predictable routines, and guided imagination exercises, yet rarely address the child's intuitive questions about ultimate security and cosmic order. The irony of this secularized approach is that it often treats symptoms while overlooking deeper existential needs. When a child asks, "What happens if something bad comes in the dark?" they are inquiring about the fundamental nature of protection in a universe that seems, at night, vast and potentially indifferent. The question contains theological dimensions that secular responses alone cannot satisfy. Jesus' response to the child's fear in our narrative offers a profound theological framework that addresses these deeper dimensions. Rather than dismissing the child's concerns as irrational or developmentally appropriate but ultimately inconsequential, Jesus demonstrates a radically different approach. He neither minimizes the darkness nor eliminates it through supernatural intervention. Instead, he enters into it alongside the child, embodying the incarnational principle that stands at Christianity's theological center. This response mirrors the divine approach to human vulnerability throughout salvation history. When humanity dwelled in spiritual darkness, God entered into it through the incarnation. Christ's willingness to enter the garden with the child reflects the same divine commitment expressed in Psalm 23, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The emphasis falls on the presence of the divine companion who walks through shadows with us. What renders this approach powerful is its acknowledgement that fear itself is not inherently problematic. Fear serves as a natural response to limited perception and control, conditions that accurately reflect the human position in the cosmos. Jesus does not seek to eliminate the child's fear through denial but to transform it through accompaniment. By his presence, the darkness remains objectively the same, yet subjectively becomes an entirely different experience, one characterized by wonder rather than terror. This transformation reflects the paradoxical nature of Christian courage, which never claims fearlessness but rather finds its strength in relationship. The child in the garden need not pretend the darkness has disappeared. Instead, they discover that darkness experienced in divine companionship becomes the context for a different kind of knowing, seeing, and understanding. The night garden, initially perceived as threatening, gradually reveals itself as a space of unique revelation that daylight, for all its clarity, cannot provide. The sacred garden as a threshold space. The night garden that initially evoked fear transforms, through divine companionship, into a sanctuary of revelation. But why specifically a garden? Gardens throughout Scripture represent deliberately chosen thresholds where material and spiritual realms converge, where created order and divine presence intertwine as naturally as roots in soil. In biblical narrative, gardens stand as consecrated ground for divine human encounter. Eden established this pattern as the primordial meeting place between God and humanity, where the Creator walked in the cool of the day, seeking communion with His creation. This motif continues through Scripture, from Abraham planting a tamarisk at Beersheba to call on the Lord's name, to Jesus facing his ultimate surrender in Gethsemane before resurrection morning revealed another garden as the setting for death's defeat. These sacred spaces suggest that cultivated nature serves a theological purpose, framing moments where heaven touches earth. The child's initial apprehension of the twilight garden mirrors our common misperception of threshold spaces. What appears threatening, shadowed pathways, rustling leaves, unfamiliar sounds, reveals itself as the necessary setting for divine disclosure. This tension between perceived danger and actual sanctuary mirrors the biblical pattern where divine encounters often begin with apprehension before yielding to revelation. Moses approached the burning bush with trepidation before receiving his commission. Isaiah cried, "Woe is me," before experiencing cleansing. The disciples on the stormy sea feared before recognizing Christ walking upon the waters. In this sacred backdrop, every shadow and rustling leaf gradually transforms from ominous warning to divine whisper. Jesus' appearance to the child amid garden pathways continues the biblical tradition of theophany in natural settings. Throughout Scripture, God reveals Himself in the expansiveness of created spaces rather than human-made structures. To Hagar by a spring, to Moses on Sinai, to Elijah in the still, small voice on Horeb. These divine manifestations suggest that creation itself serves as God's canvas for self-disclosure. Like an artist revealing hidden details beneath layers of shadow, Christ illuminates the garden's nocturnal beauty, transforming what seemed chaotic darkness into purposeful design. Gardens possess unique theological significance as spaces both natural and cultivated. Unlike wilderness, which represents nature untamed, gardens embody the collaborative relationship between divine creation and human cultivation, the Creator's materials shaped by the creature's hand. This dual nature mirrors the fundamental relationship between God and humanity, divine initiative met with human response. When Jesus meets the child in this garden, The setting itself silently teaches that God's presence manifests most clearly where His creation and our cultivation intersect. The twilight hour carries profound symbolic weight as a liminal threshold, neither day nor night but the transition between them. In Scripture, significant divine encounters often occur during such boundary times. Abraham receives the covenant promise as the sun was going down, Jacob wrestles with God from nightfall until daybreak, the resurrected Christ appears as day was nearly over. By situating this encounter at twilight, Jesus meets the child in temporal as well as spatial liminality, a moment when ordinary perception yields to deeper spiritual sight. The narrative reveals a profound theological truth in Jesus' approach to the child. The divine initiative, God moving toward humanity before being sought, stands at the heart of Christian revelation. Jesus actively seeks the child, mirroring the biblical pattern where divine pursuit precedes human awareness. God calling to Adam in Eden despite his hiding, the shepherd leaving 99 sheep to find the one, the father running toward the prodigal son while still a long way off. This garden encounter reaffirms that divine love manifests as initiative. God always moves first, approaching us before we recognize our need. Equally significant is Jesus' appearance in approachable human form rather than transcendent glory. The Incarnation's mystery finds expression in this garden meeting, divinity clothed in accessibility. Jesus' gentle presence reflects divine accommodation, eternal glory tempered to meet a child's comprehension and comfort. Not with overwhelming brightness but with the gentle countenance that once prompted little ones to gather around him does Christ appear. The transformation of the child's anxiety into wonder reveals the fundamental pattern of divine encounter. Fear, a natural response to mystery, gradually yields to fascination as Jesus reveals the garden's nocturnal beauty. This progression mirrors the biblical pattern where fear transforms into wonder. Isaiah's terror before the throne becomes commissioned prophecy. The shepherd's fright at angelic appearance transforms into joyful witnessing. Jesus reframes the garden by investing it with meaning, converting the unknown from threat to invitation. As the child's perception shifts from seeing the garden as dangerous to recognizing it as sacred ground, we witness the essence of spiritual formation, not the removal of darkness but the discovery of presence within it. The shadows remain, but their meaning transforms. The rustling leaves now whisper divine secrets. The obscured pathways now invite exploration alongside the divine guide. What has changed is not the garden itself but the child's relationship to it, a microcosm of how divine presence transforms our relationship to uncertainty. The theology of divine touch. In that sacred moment when presence has already begun its transformative work, Jesus extends his hand to the frightened child, a gesture both profoundly simple and theologically complex. This physical invitation represents the intersection of divine transcendence and immanence, where the cosmic creator who exists beyond all dimensional constraints makes himself known through the most elementary form of human connection. The omnipotent God who fashioned quantum particles and ignited the nuclear furnaces of distant stars now makes himself available through 5 fingers and an open palm. This extended hand embodies the fundamental movement of incarnational theology, God's determination to bridge the infinite gap between divinity and humanity through tangible means. Throughout the gospel narratives, Jesus consistently uses physical touch as the precursor to supernatural transformation. Touching lepers before healing, taking the hands of the feverish before restoring health, grasping lifeless fingers before commanding resurrection. In a society structured around purity codes, these physical connections declared the inauguration of a new covenant wherein God's holiness transforms human brokenness rather than being contaminated by it. The theological significance resonates deeply when we understand Christ's touch as the culmination of divine revelation. The progression from the unapproachable deity of Exodus who could only show Moses his back, to the God whose fullness of deity dwells bodily as Paul writes to the Colossians. This hand operates as sacramental reality, where ordinary human touch becomes the vehicle for extraordinary divine encounter, much like baptismal waters or Eucharistic elements serve as tangible conduits of divine presence. When the child's small fingers tentatively reach toward Jesus' outstretched hand, they intertwine with divine warmth that immediately dissolves the sharp edges of fear. This connection mirrors what occurs when a parent gently places a reassuring hand on a child's shoulder during a thunderstorm, the immediate transformation of perceived threat into manageable experience. Yet Jesus' touch transcends even the most perfect parental comfort, carrying not just momentary reassurance but eternal security, not merely present safety but existential belonging. The moment of contact between divine offer and human acceptance constitutes the fundamental posture of faith, not as intellectual assent to theological propositions, but as physical surrender to divine guidance. Those small fingers curling into the Creator's palm communicate trust more eloquently than any creedal statement, whispering without words, "I will go where you lead." They embody receptivity to grace, the theological principle that salvation comes as gift rather than achievement, requiring only openness to what is freely offered. This physical connection establishes what developmental psychology identifies as secure attachment, the foundational relationship enabling healthy exploration. Neurobiologically, such touch activates systems that counteract fear, regulating the body's stress responses at levels beneath conscious thought. Jesus' hand works through these same biological pathways while simultaneously transcending them, creating both neurological calm and spiritual security. What parallels exist between divine protection and parental love? Both involve asymmetrical relationships wherein the stronger party assumes responsibility for the vulnerability of the weaker. Jesus' extended hand represents the perfection of what human parental instinct only approximates: protection untainted by imperfection, patience unlimited by fatigue, wisdom unclouded by ignorance, and love unmarred by self-interest. The warmth radiating from this simple contact transforms the garden's shadows from sources of terror to objects of curiosity. What once appeared as threatening shapes now invite exploration, their mysterious outlines softened by the security of divine accompaniment. The child's rigid posture gradually relaxes as fear dissolves into wonder. Breathing slows from rapid shallow gasps to the deeper rhythms of calm presence, and wide eyes shift from darting panic to focused attention on the path ahead. With hands joined, the pair prepares to journey deeper into the nighttime garden. This physical connection establishes the secure base necessary for exploration, allowing the child to encounter the unknown without being overwhelmed by it. No longer isolated in fear, the child experiences what theologians call participated knowing, understanding reality not as a distant observer but as an accompanied participant. What might have remained frightening in isolation becomes fascinating in accompaniment, for the divine guide who knows each shadow's true nature transforms the experience of darkness itself. Stars as divine night lights. The night sky unfolds in resplendent glory as Jesus guides the child's attention upward, transforming what might have remained frightening in isolation into a cosmos of divine intention. With gentle guidance, he directs the child's gaze toward the heavenly expanse, where countless luminous points pierce the darkness above. What modern astronomy measures in light years and mathematical constants takes on profoundly different significance when Jesus frames these distant suns not as random stellar formation but as purposefully positioned beacons of divine watchfulness. The canopy of stars stretches across the firmament like diamonds scattered on velvet, their brilliance magnified by the garden's darkness. Where scientists observe nuclear fusion and spectral classifications, Jesus reveals an intimate design, cosmic night lights strategically placed by a father who anticipated his children's fears long before they experienced them. Do you see how they shine for you? Jesus asks, his voice carrying the weight of one who called each star into existence. These celestial bodies, massive furnaces sustaining nuclear fusion at their cores, simultaneously serve as tender expressions of providential care. Their light, traveling across vast interstellar distances, arrives precisely when needed to illuminate a child's path through darkened moments. Pause for a moment. Gaze upward and let the stars whisper to your heart. The very vastness that might overwhelm becomes intimate when perceived through the lens of divine intention. Just as Abraham stood beneath this endless canopy when God instructed him to look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able, So too can the child find assurance in these celestial sentinels. The innumerable celestial bodies became tangible symbols of an equally incalculable promise, descendants as numerous as the stars themselves. This divine pedagogy employed visible astronomical bodies to communicate invisible spiritual realities. Jesus' explanation to the child continues this established pattern of celestial symbolism. The stars that once guided Abraham toward covenant confidence now guide a frightened child toward security in divine presence. While their scientific properties remain unchanged, their theological significance transforms through relational framing. Throughout antiquity, mariners relied on celestial navigation to traverse vast oceans. Phoenician sailors charted Mediterranean routes by tracking polaris, while Polynesian voyagers memorized star paths across the Pacific. The Vikings developed sunstones to locate stars even in twilight conditions. What served as navigational constants for ancient travelers similarly functions as spiritual reference points for those traversing interior landscapes of uncertainty. The stars remain fixed while everything beneath them changes, Jesus explains, kneeling beside the child. When you feel lost, they offer consistent guidance, just as my presence remains constant through your changing circumstances. Stars begin as diffuse clouds of hydrogen that, through gravitational compression, transform common elements into radiant energy. This process occurring throughout the universe represents both scientific law and divine artistry. For stars to function as night lights, Earth must maintain optimal distance from the Sun, the atmosphere must possess correct transparency, and human eyes must contain specialized cells capable of detecting minimal light. These precisely calibrated conditions suggest intentional design rather than random occurrence. Jesus guides the child to recognize that darkness itself becomes a prerequisite for perceiving these celestial wonders. Some things, Jesus explains, can only be seen when other lights diminish. Your eyes need time to adjust, but when they do, you discover illumination was present all along. Through this astronomical object lesson, Jesus reframes the child's perception of darkness. What initially represented absence and threat now reveals itself as the necessary backdrop for perceiving divine provision. The night no longer signifies abandonment but instead becomes the canvas upon which God's faithful presence becomes uniquely visible. The stars' astronomical distances emphasize divine foresight. Light from even the nearest star takes over 4 years to reach Earth, while most visible stars emitted their light decades or centuries before reaching human eyes. Each star, Jesus explains, demonstrates that I prepare provisions for you long before you realize you need them. This perspective transforms astronomical bodies from impersonal phenomena into expressions of divine thoughtfulness. The same stars that astrophysicists study through spectroscopy become, through Jesus' interpretation, intentional communications of providential care. Without contradicting their scientific properties, he reveals their deeper significance as expressions of divine consideration. The child begins to perceive the night differently now. What initially appeared as emptiness reveals itself as carefully arranged fullness. The darkness, rather than representing divine absence, becomes the necessary condition for perceiving divine presence in uniquely powerful ways. Without darkness, these celestial reminders would remain invisible, overwhelmed by daylight's dominance. This perspective finds resonance in Psalm 19, where David observes that the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. The night sky becomes God's communication medium, a visual sermon without words that spans cultures and centuries. The star's silent testimony speaks volumes about divine character, revealing a creator who embeds reassurance within creation itself. For the child, this astronomical theology transforms fear into fascination. The same darkness that once harbored imagined threats now houses intentional reassurance. The stars become divine communication devices, strategically positioned to remind God's children they are never truly alone. Their consistency mirrors divine faithfulness, present every night, whether visible through clouds or temporarily obscured. Even when you cannot see them, Jesus explains, the stars continue shining. Their light remains constant despite changing atmospheric conditions, just as my presence remains with you regardless of your emotional weather. The wisdom of flowers that close at night. While the stars maintain their vigilant presence overhead, a subtle transformation occurs at the child's feet as Jesus kneels beside a cluster of flowers gradually folding their petals. What appears at first glance to be botanical surrender actually represents one of nature's most elegant protection mechanisms, a divine blueprint for the rhythm of engagement and withdrawal woven into creation itself. Jesus gently guides the child's attention downward, away from the celestial expanse. "Look here," he says softly, pointing to a patch of vibrant marigolds whose golden petals now curl inward as if responding to an unheard command. The child's face clouds with concern. "Are they dying?" the child asks, reaching out tentatively to touch a blossom that just hours ago had been fully open to the sun. "No," Jesus responds with a reassuring smile, drawing the child closer with a protective gesture. "They're merely preparing for rest, just as you will soon prepare for sleep. These flowers close their petals each evening to protect their delicate centers from the night's cold and dew. By morning, they'll unfold again, ready to receive the sun's warmth." Within each flower stem, specialized cells respond to the absence of light, causing some to contract while others expand. This cellular movement results in the gradual folding of petals, like the gentle closing of a beloved storybook at day's end, signaling transition to quietude and rest. "Touch the inside of this flower," Jesus invites, guiding the child's finger to a partially closed tulip. "Feel how soft and vulnerable these inner structures are. When these petals close, they create a sanctuary, a temporary shelter against nighttime conditions that might otherwise damage what's most precious." The closing petals also conserve the flower's resources. During daylight hours, flowers produce sweet nectars to attract pollinators. At night, when most insects have returned to their hives, this energy would serve no purpose. The closing represents divine efficiency, a cessation of activity when such activity would no longer bear fruit. "God has designed these plants with wisdom," Jesus explains. "They don't resist the night or fight against it. They adapt to it with graceful acceptance, much like how you draw your curtains at night to create your own sanctuary of rest." The child watches, fascinated, as Jesus points out different species responding uniquely to the approaching night. Daisies fold their petals over their center. Dandelions close completely. Water lilies sink beneath the pond's surface, each following nature's lullaby in its own distinctive way. From the beginning of creation, Jesus continues, God established rhythms of activity and rest. Even after forming the heavens and earth, the Creator himself observed a day of rest, not from exhaustion, but to establish a pattern for all creation to follow. This revelation transforms what might have appeared as weakness, the flower's closure, into a demonstration of divinely orchestrated wisdom. Just as these delicate blooms require periods of protected withdrawal, human souls likewise need sacred intervals of rest and spiritual closure. "There are times," Jesus explains, pointing to a particularly beautiful crocus now fully closed, "when you too will need to draw inward to protect what is most precious within you. This is not failure or retreat, it is wisdom. Even I would often withdraw to solitary places to pray, stepping away from the constant demands of ministry to commune with my Father." The child nods slowly, beginning to understand. Contemporary society often valorizes constant productivity, creating expectations contrary to the created order. By highlighting this simple botanical rhythm, Jesus establishes theological permission for human boundaries and spiritual Sabbath, the necessary intervals of withdrawal that enable more fruitful periods of engagement. "But notice," Jesus says, directing the child's attention to a fully closed morning glory, "how the flower doesn't remain closed permanently. Tomorrow it will open again, receiving light and sharing its beauty. The pattern resembles the rhythm of your favorite bedtime song, periods of sound and silence working together to create something beautiful." Jesus guides the child to a stone bench beside a cluster of evening primrose, flowers that reverse the common pattern by opening at dusk rather than closing. God's wisdom includes remarkable diversity, he explains. While most flowers close with evening, these bloom precisely when darkness falls, offering their nectar to night-flying moths. Even in apparent contradiction, there exists divine intention. This counterexample reinforces the principle that spiritual rhythms may manifest differently across individuals and seasons of life. While one person retreats into prayer, another might be specifically called to emerge into service during difficult periods. In creation, Jesus says, "You can see how nothing happens without purpose. The flowers close not from fear but from divine design, participating in rhythms established before the foundation of the world." Remember, Jesus says as he gently closes his hand around the child's smaller one, that protection and vulnerability each have their proper season. There is wisdom in knowing when to remain open and when to close, when to engage and when to withdraw. The child's initial concern has transformed completely. What appeared as botanical death now reveals itself as sacred participation in divine rhythms, nature's testimony to the intentional patterns established in creation. Nocturnal creatures as nighttime companions. As the peaceful lesson of the flowers gives way to something unexpected, a soft rustling emanates from nearby shrubbery. In that moment of startled attention, the child is about to discover that what humans often dismiss as absence of light actually represents an entirely different realm of existence, one meticulously crafted by the same creator who formed the stars overhead. The child instinctively draws closer to Jesus as a pair of luminous eyes appears between the garden foliage. Jesus smiles reassuringly and gestures toward the creature emerging into the open space, an owl with feathers the color of moonlight. Its wings unfold with barely a whisper as it glides to a nearby branch. "Look closely," Jesus says softly. "This owl can see 8 times better in darkness than a human can." The creator arranged each tiny feather around its face like a satellite dish, collecting the faintest sounds from creatures moving in the underbrush. Even the structure of its wing feathers has been specially crafted with serrated edges that silence its flight, allowing it to approach undetected. The child's initial alarm transforms into wonder. In every shadow, God has whispered a promise of care and innovation. Jesus explains how the owl's remarkable eyes contain far more light-sensitive rod cells than human eyes, capturing even the smallest fragments of available light. This nocturnal hunter thrives within darkness, embodying divine intention rather than mere adaptation. From beneath a cluster of ferns, a hedgehog emerges, its spiny silhouette distinctive even in low light. The child watches, fascinated, as the small creature navigates with confidence through what would be impenetrable darkness to human perception. This little one, Jesus explains, possesses nearly 36 different muscles dedicated to its protective spines alone. Though its eyesight is limited, the creator compensated with whiskers so sensitive they can detect air movements smaller than a human breath. Every spine represents a defensive innovation, providing protection without requiring speed or strength. As Jesus speaks, other nocturnal inhabitants reveal themselves: dormice climbing nimbly along branches, bats swooping overhead with mathematical precision, and foxes moving with deliberate stealth along the garden's edge. The child notices how each creature moves with purpose, no longer appearing threatening but marvelously designed. These creatures, Jesus continues, are not mistakes or afterthoughts in creation. They represent divine forethought, being specifically designed to inhabit the nighttime hours. Their existence completes the tapestry of life, ensuring that no moment goes unwatched, no environmental niche remains unfilled. The child's expression shifts from trepidation to fascination. A small shrew scurries nearby, pausing momentarily in its relentless hunt for insects. Jesus explains how this diminutive creature must consume nearly its own body weight daily, its heart beating over 1,000 times per minute. Its metabolism burns with such intensity that even brief periods without nourishment would prove fatal. Yet the garden's nocturnal ecosystem provides precisely the sustenance it requires. Most humans, Jesus observes, view darkness as absence, a void to be filled, an emptiness awaiting light's return. But observe how the Creator sees differently. These nighttime hours represent presence, fullness expressed in different forms. These creatures flourish because of darkness, not despite it. The child reaches out cautiously toward a magnificent lunar moth that has alighted on a nearby leaf, its pale green wings spanning wider than the child's hand. To the child's surprise, the delicate creature remains still, accepting the human presence without fear. In this moment of connection, the child feels a sudden courage. If this fragile being navigates the darkness with such confidence, perhaps human fears of the unknown are similarly unnecessary. This moth, Jesus explains, lives as an adult for merely a week. It possesses no mouth and cannot eat. Its entire existence as a winged creature is dedicated to continuing life through reproduction. Its brief presence reveals a profound truth about divine purpose. Value is measured not in duration but in faithful fulfillment of design. Jesus indicates how the ecosystem functions as an integrated whole. The owl balances rodent populations, the hedgehog consumes insects that might damage plants, bats pollinate night-blooming flowers, foxes control prey species while dispersing seeds. What appears as random activity reveals itself as harmonious interdependence. Consider, Jesus suggests, how these nocturnal beings demonstrate that darkness has never been abandoned by the Creator. They illustrate divine thoroughness, a determination that no space, no condition, no environment would exist without appropriate inhabitants. The theological implications gradually unfold in the child's understanding. If God has so meticulously equipped creatures specifically for darkness, providing capabilities that transform limitation into advantage, then perhaps human experiences of metaphorical darkness might similarly contain hidden provisions rather than divine abandonment. Jesus guides the child toward a moonlit clearing where several rabbits graze cautiously. Their constant vigilance, ears rotating like radar dishes, noses twitching to analyze countless scents, demonstrates another dimension of nocturnal existence. Notice, Jesus points out, how these creatures compensate for vulnerability with extraordinary watchfulness. Their apparent fragility conceals remarkable resilience, a paradox that appears throughout creation. As the child observes this nocturnal community with growing confidence, Jesus articulates the deeper lesson. When humans experience darkness, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, they often conclude they have been forsaken. Yet these creatures testify otherwise. Their specialized existence demonstrates that the Creator anticipated every condition, providing not merely for survival but for flourishing even in what appears as absence. Fireflies as bearers of divine light. Beyond the nocturnal creatures with their remarkable adaptations, tiny points of luminescence begin to appear throughout the garden. First one, then dozens, then hundreds. These fireflies, unlike the other nocturnal beings merely adapted to perceive within darkness, actually generate light from within their own bodies, a phenomenon that transcends mere survival to become a mysterious embodiment of how divine light manifests in seemingly abandoned spaces. Look, Jesus whispers, directing the child's attention to these living lanterns. These small creatures carry within themselves the very substance they appear to lack in their environment. What seems like magical light is actually a sophisticated biochemical reaction. The child watches, mesmerized, as Jesus explains the fundamental aspects of bioluminescence, how specialized cells in the firefly's abdomen contain a chemical called luciferin that, when combined with oxygen and the enzyme luciferase, produces their characteristic glow. In these pulses of light, we glimpse how divine presence often appears in moments of our darkest circumstances. Brief, purposeful, and perfectly efficient. Notice, Jesus continues, how each firefly's illumination follows a distinct pattern, rhythmic pulses that speak a visual language. He explains that male fireflies flash in specific sequences unique to their species, while females respond with precisely timed answers. This silent conversation of light represents a divine choreography, a dance of hope illuminating the darkness with purposeful rhythm. The child observes that some fireflies synchronize their flashing across the entire garden, creating waves of coordinated illumination. In certain parts of the world, Jesus notes, thousands of fireflies illuminate in perfect unison, transforming forests into cathedrals of living light. Individual expression becomes communal testimony when multiplied. As they watch this nocturnal symphony unfold, Jesus gently guides the child toward deeper understanding. Consider the profound wisdom embedded in these creatures. They illuminate their immediate surroundings with brief, intentional flashes rather than attempting to banish darkness entirely. The child notices how even these momentary pulses transform perception, revealing the garden's features in luminous glimpses. The darkness between flashes no longer feels threatening but pregnant with anticipation. This intermittent light, Jesus observes, teaches us that divine illumination often comes in moments of clarity precisely when needed. Jesus draws the child's attention to how fireflies appear at the threshold between day and night, during what naturalists call the gloaming, that liminal time when conventional sight fails but before complete darkness descends. Similarly, he explains, spiritual illumination often manifests when human understanding reaches its limits, neither in full clarity nor complete absence. With characteristic wisdom, Jesus shifts from natural observation to spiritual application. Throughout human history, he notes, darkness has symbolized uncertainty, doubt, or spiritual desolation, times when divine presence seems imperceptible. Yet these luminous creatures remind us that absence of constant light does not indicate abandonment. The child notices that each firefly's light appears most brilliant against the darkest backdrop. Jesus affirms this observation. The prophet Isaiah wrote of those who walk in darkness yet see a great light. This paradox, that certain divine truths become most visible precisely within darkness, challenges our assumption that spiritual clarity requires constant illumination. Jesus gestures toward the communal aspect of the fireflies' display. Observe how their individual lights, modest alone, create a collective brilliance that transforms the entire garden. This illustrates how believers throughout history have carried divine light into dark places through faithful presence rather than overwhelming power. The most remarkable aspect, Jesus continues, is that they generate light from within themselves rather than merely reflecting external sources. He explains that their capacity for luminescence develops throughout their life cycle, creating an intrinsic ability to illuminate their surroundings. The theological implications unfold as Jesus connects this biological reality to spiritual truth. Divine light doesn't merely shine upon believers externally but develops within them, an internal capacity to generate illumination precisely when surrounding circumstances grow darkest. The child notices that fireflies are most vulnerable during illumination, as their light makes them visible to predators. Jesus acknowledges this reality. Bearing light often involves vulnerability. These creatures risk exposure precisely when fulfilling their purpose. Similarly, those who carry divine light into dark situations often experience vulnerability rather than immediate protection. As their numbers increase throughout the garden, Jesus observes how fireflies create a living constellation mirroring the stars above. Heaven and earth reflect one another, he notes. The same Creator who placed lights in the heavens has embedded luminous capacity within Earth's creatures. Jesus kneels beside the child and gently cups his hands around a single firefly that has landed nearby. The insect's glow illuminates his palms from within, creating an ethereal effect as light shines through the edges of his fingers. Remember this, he says softly. True spiritual illumination comes not from eliminating darkness but from carrying light within it. Each small bearer of light transforms its surroundings through faithful presence. The child, initially fearful of the garden's darkness, now gazes in wonder at its transformed landscape, where each tiny light contributes to a living tapestry of illumination. What once appeared threatening now reveals itself as sacred space where certain wonders can only be perceived in the interplay of darkness and light, a dance of divine hope illuminating the night. The garden as classroom for divine lessons. As the child's perception shifts from fear to wonder, a profound realization emerges. This garden journey represents more than mere exploration. The arrangement of stars, flowers, nocturnal creatures, and fireflies constitutes a deliberate pedagogical framework. What appears as a simple nighttime walk transforms into an intricate theological classroom, where abstract concepts of divine provision, protection, and presence materialize through tangible, observable phenomena particularly suited to a child's comprehension. In examining Jesus' pedagogical methodology throughout this encounter, we observe a pattern distinctly different from conventional religious instruction. Rather than beginning with abstract theological propositions or doctrinal statements, Jesus employs object lessons, utilizing immediate, concrete examples from the surrounding environment to communicate transcendent truths. Each element within the garden serves as a carefully selected instructional tool, perfectly calibrated to the child's developmental capacity. This approach stands in marked contrast to traditional religious education, which often begins with abstract concepts requiring sophisticated cognitive frameworks. Many traditional Sunday school curricula commence with complex theological constructs, the Trinity, omnipresence, sovereignty, presenting them as disembodied propositions for children to memorize rather than experience. Such methods frequently overwhelm developing minds, creating cognitive dissonance between abstract spiritual claims and a child's concrete understanding of reality. Jesus' garden classroom operates on fundamentally different principles. Each element functions as a carefully crafted parable containing theological significance. Stars overhead communicate divine foresight, that provision precedes need. Closing flowers demonstrate the Creator's intentional rhythms embedded within creation. Nocturnal creatures reveal specialized adaptations evidencing meticulous divine attention, and fireflies illustrate how light can be carried within, appearing precisely when illumination becomes necessary. This methodology mirrors Jesus' approach documented throughout the Gospel narratives. When questioned about the kingdom of God, Jesus responds with references to mustard seeds, leaven in bread, and hidden treasure. When addressing anxiety, he directs attention to lilies and birds. When explaining spiritual rebirth, he points to wind moving through trees. In each instance, Jesus transforms ordinary objects into extraordinary vehicles for spiritual comprehension. This approach aligns perfectly with developmental psychology principles. Children primarily engage with their environment through direct sensory experience before advancing to abstract conceptualization, much as a symphony requires each instrumental section to create a complete musical experience. By utilizing tangible objects as metaphorical bridges to spiritual concepts, Jesus employs methods perfectly matched to the child's cognitive capabilities. Furthermore, this approach recognizes the limitations of language alone in conveying spiritual truths. Abstract theological terminology, omniscience, transcendence, sovereignty, remains conceptually inaccessible to developing minds. Yet these same concepts, when embodied in fireflies illuminating darkness or flowers closing protectively at night, become immediately comprehensible. The garden setting thus bypasses linguistic limitations, allowing direct experiential engagement with theological principles. The multisensory nature of this divine classroom transforms the child's understanding through comprehensive experience. Jesus engages not merely visual perception but creates a complete sensory encounter. The gentle pressure of his hand provides tactile reassurance. Sounds of nocturnal creatures establish an auditory landscape of continuous activity. The fragrance of night-blooming flowers offers olfactory evidence of beauty designed for darkness. Neuroscience confirms that such multisensory learning experiences create stronger neural connections and memory formation than verbal instruction alone could achieve. Equally significant is the sequential progression of instruction throughout the garden journey, beginning with the most distant yet visible elements, stars. Before gradually focusing attention on progressively closer phenomena, Jesus creates a deliberate movement from cosmic to intimate scales. This establishes a comprehensive framework of divine care spanning all creation before focusing on individualized attention, allowing the child's internal understanding to develop alongside external observations. Instead of directly addressing the child's initial fear, Jesus progressively replaces it through sequential revelations of wonder. Each successive encounter builds upon previous lessons, creating an accumulative theological framework that constructs confidence rather than merely alleviating anxiety. This sophisticated educational approach recognizes that direct confrontation of negative emotions often reinforces rather than resolves them, while replacement with positive alternatives creates sustainable transformation in the child's perception. The biblical principle underlying this nighttime encounter reflects the fundamental truth articulated in Romans 1 verse 20, where Paul asserts that God's invisible attributes, namely, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. The garden becomes a living testament to this principle. Creation itself contains embedded theological knowledge accessible even to children when properly interpreted. What distinguishes this educational approach is its accessibility regardless of age, intellectual capacity, or educational background. The child experiencing fireflies comprehends how light transforms darkness through direct observation. The protective spines of a hedgehog demonstrate divine protection without requiring complex theological vocabulary. Creation functions as a universal theological text written in a language everyone can comprehend. A divine pedagogy where stars, flowers, animals, and insects collectively reveal the Creator's nature through their individual attributes and interconnected relationships. Transformation of fear into sacred wonder. The nighttime garden reveals an astonishing truth about human spiritual development. Certain dimensions of divine revelation become uniquely accessible when darkness falls. As our journey through this theological exploration continues, we observe a remarkable metamorphosis taking place within the child's interior landscape. What began as apprehension has gradually yielded to something far more profound, a sacred wonder that transcends ordinary perception. This transformation manifests visibly in the child's demeanor. Tense shoulders have relaxed, eyes that once darted nervously now linger appreciatively on nocturnal wonders. Hands previously clutched anxiously at Jesus' fingers now extend with exploratory confidence. Deep within, a new language of faith begins to speak, replacing fear with awe. This shift signifies a fundamental recalibration of the child's spiritual orientation toward the unknown. Jesus engages a profound pedagogical strategy, rather than relying on direct reassurance about darkness. By illuminating elements visible only when daylight recedes, celestial patterns, specialized adaptations of nocturnal creatures, the bioluminescent symphony of fireflies, he communicates that darkness constitutes a specialized environment for particular manifestations of divine creativity. This approach challenges deeply embedded cultural associations historically assigned to darkness. From ancient Manichaeism's dualistic opposition of light and darkness to medieval artistic depictions associating blackness with spiritual corruption, Western religious tradition has reinforced the equation of darkness with divine absence. Eastern philosophical traditions similarly equate enlightenment with illumination. The garden experience systematically dismantles these assumptions by demonstrating empirically that certain elements of divine glory remain imperceptible until light recedes. The theological implications extend beyond comfort. This encounter suggests that spiritual formation occurs through the recontextualization of darkness rather than its elimination. The darkness itself remains unchanged. What transforms is the child's relationship to it. This mirrors the broader pattern of spiritual development wherein difficult circumstances become the context in which divine attributes manifest most clearly. As the psalmist wrote, "He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him," Psalm 18 verse 11, suggesting that divine mystery intentionally dwells within obscurity. Several divine attributes appear distinctively within darkness. God's transcendence finds natural expression in the vastness of night skies, revealing the universe's immensity. Divine mystery, acknowledging that God's nature exceeds full human understanding, corresponds to the partial visibility that darkness affords. Divine rest, exemplified in creation's Sabbath pattern, finds expression in the quietude of nightfall. This gradual transformation affects the child's temporal experience. Full absorption in wonder temporarily suspends normal time perception. Minutes and hours blur as attention shifts from chronological progression to the eternal now of divine encounter. This alteration reflects the theological principle that authentic divine encounters transcend ordinary time constraints, creating kairos moments, sacred time distinguished from sequential chronos time. Jesus' pedagogical brilliance becomes evident in his gradual transfer of agency to the child. What begins as passive reception transforms into active exploration, like a caterpillar emerging as a butterfly. Jesus initiates this transition subtly, acknowledging the child's observations, responding affirmatively to questions about night creatures. These affirmations cultivate confidence until the child begins discovering garden wonders independently, identifying constellation patterns, noticing the intricate structure of a spider's web glistening with dew, or following a foraging hedgehog with curious delight rather than fear. This transfer mirrors the developmental pattern of spiritual maturation, wherein believers progress from dependent reception of theological truths to active participation in their discovery. The garden journey serves as a microcosm of spiritual development, not eliminating unknowns, but developing confidence to explore them in divine company. The most profound theological lesson emerges in what remains consistent throughout this transformation. The child discovers that divine attention to detail, meticulous care, and artistic flourish evident in daytime creation extends seamlessly into the night realm. The intricate design of the owl's silent flight feathers, precise timing mechanisms in night-blooming flowers, complex synchronized signaling of fireflies, all testify to divine consistency across all conditions. This consistency resolves the child's initial fear. The revelation is not that darkness poses no challenges. Nocturnal predators remain hunters, temperatures drop, visibility remains limited, but that divine faithful presence extends uninterrupted across all conditions. The Lord who shepherds by day continues his watch by night. The Creator who designed daylight ecosystems has equipped nocturnal realms with equal care. This realization addresses the core spiritual question underlying childhood fear: does God remain present and attentive when circumstances change? The garden experience answers affirmatively by demonstrating consistency across conditions. The child learns experientially that divine faithfulness remains unchanged when visible circumstances alter dramatically. By journey's end, the transformation completes itself. The space that initially evoked apprehension has become a sanctuary of wonder. The darkness once perceived as threatening now reveals itself as a specialized environment for particular divine revelations. The child who first needed constant reassurance now explores with confidence, discovering evidences of divine care embedded within the nocturnal world. The mind and heart rewired to associate darkness with wonder rather than threat, embodying spiritual transformation in its fullest sense. The sacred return to sleep. This threshold between wakefulness and slumber represents perhaps the most intimate theological revelation of the garden journey. As Jesus and the child begin to retrace their steps toward home, there's a subtle shift in their movement, not an abrupt departure from wonder, but a gentle transition carrying all they've experienced together. The garden's lessons linger as living memories, no longer mere cognitive concepts but embodied wisdom the child now carries within. The path back unfolds with unhurried purpose. Jesus walks slightly ahead now, his hand still connected to the child's, but his posture suggests a gentle leading rather than protective enclosure. The child's steps, once hesitant and cautious, now match the confident rhythm of their companion. This physical journey mirrors an interior transformation. What began as an excursion into threatening territory has become a processional return, bearing treasures of newfound perception. As they approach the threshold of home, Jesus kneels to meet the child's gaze. The impending separation carries transformed meaning. Sleep emerges in this moment as spiritual practice. It represents the ultimate act of human vulnerability, the complete relinquishment of consciousness and control. In closing our eyes, we practice a profound surrender that transcends our waking acts of faith. Sleep requires an extraordinary vulnerability. We completely abandon self-protection during this regular human experience. Prayer may surrender our will while maintaining awareness. Worship may focus our attention while preserving consciousness. But sleep demands absolute relinquishment, a daily rehearsal of faith's fundamental posture, complete trust amid complete vulnerability. Psalm 121 verses 3-4 illuminates this dimension. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. This divine vigilance addresses childhood bedtime anxieties. While human guardians eventually succumb to sleep, leaving their protective watch temporarily suspended, the divine guardian maintains constant vigil. God's care establishes itself as categorically different, a vigilance without interruption. The child pauses at the doorway, looking back at the garden now transformed by evening's embrace. "Thank you," comes the whisper, almost inaudible but deeply felt. Jesus smiles in quiet acknowledgement of this moment's significance. Having encountered divine presence in darkness, the child now approaches bedtime with altered perception. The separation that once triggered abandonment fears represents entry into a different mode of communion. The darkness that once harbored threats now cradles revelation. The closing of eyes that once signified vulnerability initiates sacred engagement. The garden journey has provided concrete experiences that remain accessible beyond this night. The child has witnessed divine care embodied in the ecological design of nocturnal creatures. The child has observed divine watchfulness manifested in stars placed as celestial sentinels. These sensory encounters provide internal resources, mental touchstones to which the child can return when fears resurface. This experimental reservoir addresses childhood sleep anxieties at their theological roots. The garden journey has engaged profound questions. Does divine care persist when consciousness recedes? Does separation from wakefulness mean separation from divine presence? Does vulnerability necessarily entail danger? Through the garden's living parables, Jesus has established answers that resonate beyond intellectual understanding. The closing flowers demonstrate that withdrawal serves as protection rather than abandonment. The nocturnal creatures reveal that darkness houses its own unique forms of life. The fireflies illustrate that light appears precisely when and where needed. Each element contributes to a coherent framework that transforms sleep from fearful necessity to sacred participation. As they reach the home's entrance, Jesus guides the child toward familiar bedtime movements. The washing of hands, the changing into sleep clothes, the arrangement of covers. These ordinary actions now carry extraordinary significance. They have become ritualized preparations for sacred surrender rather than reluctant concessions to biological demand. The transformation reflects patterns present in faith traditions, where ordinary substances become vehicles of spiritual significance. When Jesus sits beside the bed, his presence reframes another aspect of sleep anxiety: the fear of missing important experiences during unconsciousness. Children often resist sleep partly from this concern. Jesus addresses this anxiety by investing sleep with purpose. Sleep becomes a necessary phase of spiritual formation rather than an interruption of experience. The child's eyes grow heavy as Jesus begins soft whispers of promise. "I am with you always," he speaks, echoing his assurance in Matthew 28 verse 20. This present tense affirmation extends beyond wakefulness into sleep's depths. The grammar itself carries significance. Not "I will be with you when you awaken," but "I am with you during consciousness and its absence alike." The child's surrender to sleep represents participation in trust. The closing of eyes becomes a physical enactment of faith's essence. In this surrender, the child rehearses the fundamental pattern of spiritual life, releasing control while maintaining connection. This practice establishes neurological pathways that associate vulnerability with safety, cultivating disposition toward trust extending beyond sleep itself. Jesus remains present as the child's breathing deepens and conscious awareness recedes. This lingering presence establishes sleep not as abandonment but as altered communion. The relationship continues uninterrupted, though its mode changes. This pattern creates anticipation of divine presence that persists through all transitions between consciousness and its absence. The transformation of bedtime addresses childhood sleep anxieties by reframing their theological foundation. The fear of separation becomes recognition of different communion. The fear of vulnerability becomes practice of sacred trust. The fear of missing experiences becomes participation in renewal. Each anxiety finds resolution through theological recontextualization, seeing the same reality through transformed perception. Our journey through the twilight garden concludes with this profound revelation. Darkness is not something to be feared, but a sacred canvas for unique divine truths. In absence of daylight, we discover aspects of God's character that remain imperceptible in noon's glare, fundamentally reorienting our relationship with vulnerability. Christ extends his hand to our innermost selves, inviting us beyond defensive barriers. Where might you encounter sacred presence in your own darkness today? The closing flowers, emerging creatures, and pulsing fireflies all reveal intentional design functioning within darkness. In every shadow, in every uncertainty of your life, remember this transformative truth. The space you fear most already holds divine presence, awaiting your recognition.